going back to your original question, what are the differences? So think about, we've all been brought up in the world of GCP and ICH GCP. It is our Bible. But if you think about it, it's number 6 of the efficacy series, and efficacy, the whole series, when you read what it relates to, is clinical trials. So all of a sudden, you're in a world with non-interventional studies where GCP...
TMF Elite, welcome back to the show. And with a podcast name like TMF Daily, it's no surprise that we'll be talking about the TMF, but specifically non-interventional studies. My guest, Stuart McCully, the co-founder of RWR-Regs, with over 2 decades of immersive clinical research experience. But what truly sets Stuart apart is his commitment to deciphering and seamlessly applying the regulations, guidelines, and best practices, sculpting them into tangible solutions for his clients. As the founder of Phoenix RWR, he's not just a consultant, he's a visionary architect, crafting indicated strategies that empower his clients to surmount any regulatory hurdle with finesse. Stuart's accolades don't stop there. He's been an integral member of the DIA CDISC TMF working group, instrumental in sculpting a TMF reference model tailored specifically for non-interventional studies, solidifying his status as a luminary in his field. Stuart, welcome to the TMF Daily Podcast.
Thanks, Nicole. All of a sudden, I feel very old. Decades of experience. Oh, dear.
You have lots of wisdom. And I'm so excited today.
It's the wisdom.
It's the wisdom. All right, so let's just get right to it. So can you just provide us a brief overview of what's non-interventional studies?
Okay. Simply put, a non-interventional study is a study usually with a marketed product. Product is, so it's a medicine, used as per its license. And when you have a protocol, it doesn't dictate, unlike a clinical trial, who's going to take which drug. So you and I, we're already taking an antibiotic, and because we're taking that antibiotic, we can then be eligible for our non-interventional study.
And why is this so significant in clinical research?
So there's a big catchword nowadays, or a hot topic called real-world evidence. What we don't tend to talk about is clinical trial evidence. So if we're going to talk about real-world evidence, we shouldn't just be talking about clinical trials. We should talk about clinical trial evidence. What do we need, and why do we need clinical trial evidence? Is the drug safe? Does it work? Simple as that. In Europe, we have to run these kinds of clinical trials to demonstrate safety and efficacy because of thalidomide. A drug was allowed onto the market. It was prescription, non-prescription. Most of the time it was over the counter. Lots of bad things happened, so we changed our regulations. Similar kind of thing happened, but with, say, sulfanilamide over in the US. So we've got clinical trial evidence. And think about it, I think according to the latest stats, the average number of patients in a phase 3 clinical trial, so the clinical trial to get your approval to market the drug, average number of patients, 700 patients. And those patients are highly selected so that you remove as many variables as possible to see that there is an impact from that drug. What then happens when that drug's approved? How many millions of people then take it? And how diverse are they from an ethnicity perspective, a genetics perspective, a social economics perspective? So we don't really know what happens with this approved drug until it goes out into the market and so many different people actually take the drug. And we don't know if it's going to continue to work because they're on multiple drugs with multiple conditions, or if the benefits are no longer outweighing the risks, the side effects. So that's where we need real-world evidence. And non-interventional studies help us to gather that data, generate that evidence. So it's evidence that your drug is still safe, still effective.
Very good. So what are some of the key differences between non-interventional studies and the other types of clinical research, such as interventional studies?
So it's an interesting one. The term interventional has always caused me grief. In the US, the FDA defines interventional. It makes sense. If you're a non-interventional study, then surely the opposite to a non-interventional study is an interventional clinical trial. In Europe, we have never defined intervention. We have low intervention, we have non-intervention. If you don't define intervention, what makes something non-interventional or interventional? It's a mess. Going back to the original question, what are the differences? So think about, we've all been brought up in the world of GCP and ICH GCP. It is our Bible. But if you think about it, it's number 6 of the efficacy series, and efficacy, the whole series, when you read what it relates to, is clinical trials. So all of a sudden, you're in a world with non-interventional studies where GCP doesn't apply. And that makes sense, because if you think about it, there is no investigational product.
Right.
That your patients, your participants, your consumers are already taking the drug. If they weren't on your study, they would still be taking that drug. So the study doesn't impact that. And as soon as you do that, so there's no investigator's brochure, there's no investigational medicinal product. And as a result of that, you're not going to have comparators. So all of that kind of element that you've got is gone. And also for non-interventional studies, there is no legal requirement in any country to monitor. Well, think about it. It's either low or no risk. Clinical trials, they can be really high risk or moderate risk. Non-interventional studies, where's the risk? Data breach, that's pretty much it. A completely different type of study.
So would you say it's a little bit easier to do non-interventional studies?
Oh, it so should be. It should be.
You would think.
Yeah, you would think. Low risk, no risk studies. The difference we have, and I am jealous of clinical trialists who have GCP and they have this kind of standard that globally is accepted. We don't have that for non-interventional studies. Every country is different. So it's simple study designs, really complex stats to overcome the bias because there's no randomization or blinding. But every country is different. Every single country. So it's the reg side of things that becomes complicated. None of it is necessarily logical.
So let's talk maybe a little bit about the regulatory requirements for your non-interventional studies and how do they differ for the interventional studies, and what challenges are researchers typically facing when they're navigating these regulations, since it's different in every country?
I think the first challenge is getting your head around the fact that GCP is not applicable. I can't believe 20 years on, I'm still having this conversation with clients. It's not applicable. If it's not applicable, then what is? And I've had auditors ask me, okay, do you need informed consent? Of course you do. Are these actually regulated? Yes. So we all go through our GCP training. What we tend to gloss over is the Declaration of Helsinki. The Declaration of Helsinki is the basis of ICH GCP. Pretty much, everything is in there. You need a protocol, you need informed consent. Your protocol needs to be approved by a research ethics committee or an IRB. Substantial amendments also need to be approved, and you need a study report at the end. That's all from Declaration of Helsinki. It wasn't unique. Declaration of Helsinki is the foundation for non-interventional studies. We don't have that next step where it's been expanded massively to, say, GCP, which is currently 66 pages, about to be 72. So that's great. So you have to go in with the mindset of, okay, we start with the declaration, and then what are the applicable regulations? Ironically, you have to look at the clinical trial regulations in each country to work out whether they are or are not applicable to non-interventional studies. Because some of them, like Bulgaria, may have a subsection that says, and for NIS, you have to do this. Or some don't actually have specific regulations. The UK is one of them. The UK, its non-interventional studies are actually governed. The requirements come from the Health Research Authority's SOPs. They're not regulations. Wow. So that's, for every country you have to go in and you spend most of your time working out what isn't relevant so you can then work out what is. It's like, right. The inverse to what you would do as a clinical trialist. It's fascinating. It's like doing jigsaw puzzles for me. I find it just exciting because you never know what you're going to find. And sometimes it's really scary. But, most of the time it's all good.
So we're so hardwired with GCP. Mm-hmm. Like, how do you throw that out the window when we're thinking about NIS studies?
It's hard. It's difficult. I think what people need to understand is, it's like I was saying before, regardless of whether your research participant, your study participant, actually took part in your non-interventional study or not, they're still taking that drug and that data is still being generated. So all of a sudden you've got that kind of risk. And that's why they're also called observational studies, because you're literally observing how people go about their daily lives. And what makes it a non-interventional study is it's clinical research, it's health related. Sounds simple, because what is even more complicated is non-interventional doesn't mean no intervention.
Mm-hmm.
Non-interventional studies, you can take blood samples. So you can intervene. The intervention part of it is totally related to, is there a healthcare intervention? So as a participant in an observational study, are you directly impacting how my health is treated? And you don't. For some people, this is really difficult to get their head around, and you can understand why. Clinical trials, we've got GCP, you do this, 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 and this. And we've done it like this for years. 1996, ICH GCP. So for some people, they've been doing this for almost 30 years. And to change that to a different type of study, it comes down to risk. It's understanding, what is this type of study? What data am I trying to generate? What evidence? What am I trying to prove? Simple as that.
You make a good point analyzing the risk. Like, what's the risk here? How high? How low?
Well, think about risk-based monitoring. So I know the FDA in their recent, I think it was the August 2023 guidance document on considerations for real-world evidence studies, they said, you should take a risk-based approach to monitoring and non-interventional studies. When there's no risk, what approach do you take? Their take was, if there is any biosampling, so if you are actually taking blood samples, etc., because there's a slightly increased level of risk compared to if they've just been going about their normal lives, that's when you monitor. But to be fair, if this is a study that's been required by a regulator, whether it's FDA, EMA, whoever, because there wasn't enough safety data at the time when you submitted your marketing authorization, it makes sense that you would do a post-authorization safety study or on the US post-marketing requirement. Makes sense. And because you're going to be submitting that and it's safety data, you would expect there to be a certain level of monitoring. But if you think about that from a TMF perspective, there's no IP, there's no investigational medicinal product. We may or may not monitor. There's no investigator's brochure. All of a sudden, there's a lot of documents you don't have. And for most of these studies, if it's not, say, an imposed study by EMA or FDA, there's also no regulatory authority approvals. And I think, the fear comes from, when you're a trialist getting into these studies, the fear comes from the unknown.
Right.
Understand what is required per country, and you'll then start seeing the trends. It becomes a lot more logical, a lot less scary. And then you're not trying to, we call it buffering or sandbagging. You're doing what you're used to try and reduce the risk. And it's a perceived risk because there is no risk. But it's just knowing what is it you should understand how to do.
You're right. You hear the word NIS and it's almost like a fear of the unknown, because we're so used to being over the top, being regulated. And with the GCP, there's a huge level of fear, but you think there's a huge level of risk.
Yeah.
So what are some common methodologies that are used in conducting non-interventional studies, and how are researchers ensuring the validity and the reliabilities of their findings?
That's a really difficult question. The beauty about clinical trials, and clinical trials will always be the gold standard to demonstrate safety and efficacy. That is always going to be the case. Why are they so good at that? It's their ability to reduce bias and mitigate confounding. So we've got our blinding and we've got our randomization. You don't have either of those in your non-interventional study. So unlike a clinical trial protocol, there is actually a section on bias and limitations in a non-interventional study protocol, because you have to list the bias and limitations you're aware of, which ones you've mitigated, and what's left, basically. So it's never going to be, what was it? They call it internal validity. It's never going to have addressed these limitations. Recently, the FDA did RCT duplicate studies. It's something I don't really agree with. Never understood why they did it. So they wanted to see if observational study results could duplicate a randomized controlled trial. It doesn't make any sense. If you think about real-world evidence, this is what happens in real life in this massive patient population versus a clinical trial. In observational studies, we're never trying to replicate that. We're trying to work out if the clinical trial results are actually relatable to the real world. So why would you duplicate it? They have limitations. You have some really cool statisticians out there that have lots of really good statistical models. FDA is starting to produce lots of guidance on, what they're expecting, how to mitigate for bias and confounding. I'm not a statistician. So that you get to the point where the results are more reliable than they had been in the past. These were the kind of studies that were either seeding studies that we use for promotional purposes, hence we've had to change our regs, or they were like N=1 studies that had no credibility. So if you see the changes in guidelines and regulations for the last 15 years, most of it's been cause and effect. We use them to promote non-interventional studies to promote and get our drug on the market. Not allowed to do that anymore. And we've used them to get into peer-reviewed journals, but we didn't have consent, etc. So what's interesting is it was the International Collaboration of Medical Journal Editors, I can't remember the full title. They have recommendations now, and in those recommendations, you have to, one, comply with the Declaration of Helsinki, and two, demonstrate that you've got ethics committee approval, and three, informed consent. If you don't have any of those, then your journal article doesn't get accepted. So we've added that depth of rigor and ethics to our publications. Some of this, when I was doing my PhD back in 1890, we would do a journals club, and we'd be reviewing things in the British Medical Journal. And I tell you what, Nicole, some of it was shocking. It literally was, according to my one patient. But we've got that rigor. We've added that rigor now.
So what are some emerging trends or advancements that you're seeing in the field of non-interventional studies, and what should we be aware of?
Oh, your questions are big. Very good, but big. Emerging trends and what should we be aware of? I would say secondary use of existing data. Currently, we talk about retrospective studies, prospective studies. And even to date, people get confused about what is retrospective, what is prospective. FDA, in their draft glossary that they published on the 6th of May, so this month, they have refined the definition of both of these. So we've got retrospective, prospective, we know what's going on. Think about that then. If you're accessing medical health records, so EHRs, electronic health records, to conduct studies, we used to call them chart reviews in the days of paper and, chalk and blackboards and all that. So secondary use. So for these types of studies, the data already exists, again, regardless of whether you're going to be doing the study. So for a patient, or from a patient perspective, they're low risk studies. There's a lot of information out there. We used to call it big data. But the problem we had was, a lot of this is not formatted text. So it was very difficult to either access or use. We have something in Europe called the European Health Data Space. So all 27 countries will have EHRs that talk to each other. So the basics of the EHRs talking to each other will be implemented in 2025. So that's just next year.
That's
so
exciting.
It is very exciting. It's all starting. Obviously not in the UK because, we blew our chances there. But anyway, the secondary part of that, or the next element of that, is all of a sudden you've got all of this data that you can access, and the regulation is pushing us so that we can actually not only access it from a healthcare perspective, but also from a research perspective, hence the secondary use. So primary use will be healthcare, secondary use is research. So that's what's happening in the EU. Big, massive thing that's happening. I don't think people quite appreciate how big a change this is, because this is tied in with, there is new pharmaceutical legislation that's coming out in the EU. The draft legislation has been published. We haven't changed the legislation in the last 20 years. This legislation directly calls out things like real-world evidence. Darwin EU, which is the data analytics and real-world interrogation network that the European Medicines Agency has created, they're running their own real-world evidence studies. So rather than just call them non-interventional studies, we call them real-world evidence studies because they don't necessarily have to be about approved drugs. So think about natural history studies, sort of following the history of a disease, how it's treated, etc. So it's not just that kind of old definition of non-interventional study, which saying that the FDA has just changed their definition and it's removed the term marketed and patient. So it's an individual and it's a product. So you are not assigned a medicine as per protocol. That's pretty much their new definition. So you can be an individual, which means, so, think about the big non-consumers, the non-consumer product companies. So your Strepsils, whatever you buy from your pharmacy, they're still medicines. But previously, they were excluded from all of this guidance because it was always about prescription medicines. So the FDA has gone bigger. So we've got secondary use of existing data. We're starting to see a more open approach to real-world evidence. EMA, by next year, their vision is to have provided access to real-world data, so European health data space, but also demonstrated the value of real-world evidence. Because previously, non-interventional studies, they were just safety studies. You just kind of did it. They were just terrible.
Right.
What we're seeing now is there is a lot of value in all of this data we already have about healthcare, and not necessarily about, whether a drug works or not. It could be patient preferences, consumer preferences. Yeah. So there's a lot happening. This is just the beginning of something that's very big, very big. One of the presentations I gave just recently, I summarized all the different guidance, draft guidance, legislation, etc., that has been published in the last 3 years in just Europe. And there's over 44 documents related to real evidence. So I think related to non-interventional studies. So there is a lot happening. That's
amazing.
It's painful to keep on top of. But
We've come a long ways.
Yeah. Because prior to that, it was probably one document every 4 years. Not now.
Yeah.
The other one is, before you jump, think about it from this perspective. Okay, so these hospitals, think about EU. The US is further ahead on this topic. But so you've got all of this EHR data. It's not in a format that you as a researcher want to access or can use. So we've created something called data intermediary service providers in Europe. So they literally are companies that will come along, take your healthcare data, and they'll curate it into a common data model so that researchers can use data from all of the different sites. So again, we're moving beyond just raw data or data that's not curated or usable to data now where you can pick and choose from sites, countries, etc. So lots happening.
So when we're approaching that data collection and analysis, how are they ensuring patient privacy and data integrity?
I'll take a sip because this might be a long one. So obviously in the US, we've got HIPAA. You've got HIPAA assured sites. Move to the EU and we have the GDPR, our General Data Protection Regulation, which we knew was coming out in 2018. We were dreading it. It was going to be the end of the world. We'd never do research again. Not that we're, pessimists in Europe. What people hadn't understood was under Article 89 of GDPR, basically what they said was each of the countries can implement a framework specific to research so that it's easier for you to access research from a trust perspective. So, there still has to be consent, or if there's not explicit consent, you've got this pseudo-anonymization. So you call it a de-identification in the US. It's a different process, but it just means that data isn't re-identifiable. So you have, we've implemented in Europe things called data protection impact assessments. So in order for us to access healthcare data, which is sensitive, let's be honest, and especially genetic information, and think rare diseases where there's so few people, there is a risk of re-identification. So you have to do a data protection impact assessment, which basically means is, are all the systems that you've implemented sufficient to ensure that you have protected the integrity of the data and the privacy of each of the patients? So you do your DPIA, and then you're submitting, if it's big data, that you can actually access this data without explicit consent, depending on the country. EU, 27 countries. Each country, God bless them, implemented the GDPR kind of caveats for research differently. European Commission has spent a lot of money trying to work out what's going on so that they can actually harmonize things. But first and foremost, it's about trust. As a patient, you're not going to allow anyone to access your data if you think, one, they're going to abuse it, and two, all of a sudden it's in the local newspaper or whatever, all your conditions, and especially if you've got health insurance, because it could impact your health insurance. So yeah, there are a lot of layers of protection.
So let's talk a little bit about technology. And what role do you see technology and data analytics playing in enhancing the efficiency and effectiveness of non-interventional studies?
I think first and foremost, let's not talk about AI. That's an overused and abused term. Think about natural language processing, whereby you can get access to free text. You can look at the trends. You can actually pull out the data that you're looking for. We would be foolish if we didn't use that kind of technology. Something that could take us days, weeks, months to analyze. And I know that from the reg. I've got software that I use to monitor regulatory sites. Within the press of a button, it does the equivalent of 110 hours for me.
Wow.
Like that. So
really?
Think about that from an images perspective, medical images. Think about that from your EHRs. Because let's be honest, my wife's a doctor. If there is a manual input and it involves handwriting, we're all doomed. It's shorthand, it's whatever, but you can train software so that it can read. It's not perfect as yet, and then you can validate it. I use tools in Regs, but I use restrictive non-learning tools because you have to understand source, you have to understand relevance, all of these kind of things. I don't want the dumb human who programmed it, me, to make the mistakes, so that as it learns and it does its tree algorithms, goes out and gathers data, what you end up with, is garbage in, garbage out. So technology, yes, absolutely. And I speak with two of the companies I work with are data curation companies. Speaking to a company very soon that actually accesses and converts images. So whether it's, X-rays, etc., so that these are accessible. And for me, think about it from an ethical perspective. Imagine the amount of information about our health and diseases that are out there that we're not using. Ethically, we should be using them. Rather than, and think about it this way. So we shouldn't ever be repeating a clinical trial or clinical study that has already been done and has valid results, because you're potentially exposing people to unnecessarily to a high-risk drug. Add to that the fact that if there is information out there that we could gather from data that already exists, that means we don't have to do these studies and or expose people to drugs or procedures, we should be getting the data from there first. Think about it, Declaration of Helsinki talks about we should do our literature reviews. For me now, we should be doing our EHR reviews. So it's not just about what's being published, it's also about what's accessible. And only when the data isn't available in both of those sources, then we do a study directly with people. Says he preaching. I'll get off my high horse now.
So let's talk a little bit about the importance of collaboration and partnerships when you're conducting a successful non-interventional study, particularly between academia, industry, and the regulatory bodies.
I worked for, this is a slide, you'll see Stuart does lots of rabbit holes. I used to work for Shire. And Shire as a company didn't do research and development, it did search and development. So what they would do was, they acknowledged that the fact that most of the innovative research was done by the universities and the academics and the innovative physicians. So I think investigator-initiated studies. So they would go out and find promising new chemical entities through the academics, then would partner with the academics and or buy their product. You talked about collaboration with regulators, yeah? That's a difficult one because you've got that potential conflict of interest.
Mm-hmm.
What I love is the EMA, if we take them as an example, they've kind of stepped aside from that conflict of interest as to, what can you and can you not use real world evidence for. They're just running their own studies, which is very novel for a regulator. They literally are going out, running studies to validate the stuff that you as a pharmaceutical company submit to them. And the question you've got to ask yourself then is, why did I not do those studies? Because they're going to ask you that. So that's one side of it. The FDA, on the other hand, so we've had a lot of guidance that's come out. You've got the public consultation. You have the opportunity to comment, to provide your own insights, and then they may or may not amend the guidance. So, from that perspective, that's the classic collaboration. You've then got I would say the middleman, or the middle people, which is the health technology assessors, which we've kind of forgotten about. Because, okay, your drug's marketed, but how does it get on the market? Someone has to buy it. We're seeing a lot more guidance coming out from the health technology assessors, because for them, they've got to interpret the clinical trial results, which isn't a requirement for regulators like FDA, EMA. The HTAs have got to work out what impact do the clinical trial results actually have on my patient population? Should I pay for that drug or not? So they've produced, think about NIS in the UK, Canada with its recent guidance and its new authority Health Canada that it created, HAS in France. They've all produced guidance to say, if you're going to do this kind of study, please consider all of the following. We talk about generalizability. It's a word I hate. What does it mean? What does it mean?
Right.
So basically, can you relate your clinical trial results to your patient population? Is there any connection between the two? And that's what they're saying. We would need to understand, if we pay for your drug, out of those 700 people that were in your clinical trial, and let's be honest, it's usually a white 40-year-old male, according to popular statistics, that's what's in your clinical trial. And then you go rest of world, and, fat people like me, or my wife or my kids, these were never tested. So what they want to know is, if we pay for this drug, is it better than what we're already paying for, and can we use it? So for me, there's a big opportunity for collaboration with the HTAs. And in Europe, very much so, because the new Health Technology Assessment Regulation, it's a long title, which becomes effective in January 2025. Previously, there were 27 countries with, I think, something like 38 different HTAs. How does that work? More than one per country. How confusing is that? So what we've got is a regulation that says part of your HTA dossier, we will all accept. You still have the per country stuff, but the main part of it is just one single one. So from a health technology assessment perspective, we're still in that position where we used to be with clinical trials, where every country had a different requirement for your clinical trial authorization. So you'd have like 64 different dossiers for your CTA. That's where we are with HCA. Come 2025 in Europe, that changes. Also, that regulation, what they've done is implement something called the Joint Clinical Assessment. So when you're at, say, end of phase 1 and you're just designing the rest of your clinical development pathway, the HTA coordination group and the EMA will have a joint meeting with you, the pharma company. So you've got the HTA, you've got the pharmaceutical assessor, EMA, and you can all get together and talk. Hallelujah. How many years has this taken?
Right.
Because you as the sponsor and the marketing authorization holder, you're developing all this stuff. You get through EMA and FDA, and then the next body, you can't even sell your drug yet. Madness. So yeah, this makes sense, but it's taken many years for us to get to this point.
It seems so simple. Like we should have been doing this years ago.
Yeah. It's what's the phrase I overuse? This is not rocket science. In order for us to get it on the market, we need approval from these two bodies. Well, it's multiple bodies, but you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
We are, if you look at the technological, I can't even say it, advances that we've seen. Think about the things that we use. I'm an Apple fan, so I'm surrounded by all of these great tools. And then you look at us in the pharmaceutical industry, and we literally are using pen and paper. Okay, we've moved on. We've got eTMFs and we've got eCRFs. The fact that we still have to use the term eCRF, everything should be electronic. Come on, people.
I know. We're really crawling here. It's taken a long time.
Risk aversion. How long has it taken for e-consent to be accepted? And yet, as individuals, we might be the individuals that are pushing against it. And this happened in the UK. Our Health Research Authority pushed out an opt-out informed consent option for clinical research. It was the pharmaceutical industry. So this is our ethics body. The pharmaceutical industry pushed back and said, no, that's too high risk. But at the same time, I can guarantee you we're all doing online banking.
Right.
I know it's not opt-out, but it's still, it's electronic and it's highly secure. So
I mean, even just Amazon. How many people order off from Amazon?
Yeah.
How much training did somebody need to learn to use that platform?
No. If it's not intuitive, why are we using it? Informed consent for me is one of my biggest frustrations. I have friends and family that send me informed consent forms because they want to participate in either a clinical trial or a non-interventional study. I've been in this industry for a long time now, and even I don't understand what the study's about or what they're being asked to consent to. To your point, you go onto Amazon or wherever, you go into your bank account, click, click, click. Yeah.
Yep. Really easy, simple,
intuitive.
The way it should be. Yep.
Yeah.
What advice would you offer to organizations that are looking to embark on non-interventional studies for like the first time based on your experience?
I'm helping companies right now doing this. Based on the experience that I've had with the companies that do this well is engage early. This is why FDA or regulators, when you're going to do a study, tell you to engage early. They're assuming that you don't know the ins and outs, the details of what's required for a non-interventional study. And it's a logical assumption. Because if you think about, the logic trail, if you're a pharmaceutical company, you've had to develop a compound. It's had to go from preclinical to clinical. You get it approved, and then you want to be doing your real-world evidence studies. I would always say to any company, regardless of what phase you're in, and especially if you're early phase, so you have a research compound but hasn't gone into the clinic yet, reach out to whoever, company, individual, learn about real-world evidence, learn about what it can provide you with, because it's a data enrichment tool, pre-approval. And this is what the FDA is driving for. You think all of the guidance the FDA has published, it is only about data that you would submit either for an NDA, your new drug application, your biological license application, or a label extension. But two out of those three, this is pre-approval. So they, one, are seeing companies submitting pre-approval, but also trying to help those companies submit successfully, do studies that are meaningful. Engage early. Literally speak to someone that knows about these kind of studies. There are plenty of people out there that can give you guidance. It's like the Matt Veaches and the Aaron Kamals of the world, these big thought leaders who can literally come in and go, bang, bang, bang. We talk about, we always used to have the target product profile, which is how do you get your new chemical entity all the way out so that you get approved. We also talk about the target value profile now, the TVP, and integrated and full, scale evidence generation. You want to be able to demonstrate, you can even demonstrate at phase 2 and into phase 3 how generalizable your data is if you've done your homework. So that's, the scientific literature, and it's the EHRs. You can easily generate that data nowadays. You don't have an excuse not to. There's been a lot of companies just recently, certainly in rare diseases, had their compounds, and I won't name them, but had their compounds rejected by the FDA because they didn't do their homework.
Right.
Inexcusable. So one of the things as well is, if you're a company that wants to know more or wants to conduct non-interventional studies, you've got to be aware that your quality management system is going to be the first place you look at. You need people within your organization that understand these types of studies. That can be taught, but also you need specifics within. Not every, you don't need a full section that's just in NIS SOPs from study start to end. A lot of your SOPs will be applicable. However, some won't. But, think about regulatory green light. A lot of companies will use the shipment of the IMP to a site as that kind of ring fence, that firewall. There's no IMP.
So from an SOP perspective, are you creating new SOPs for NIS, or you can just use your existing ones?
I would say if you're a company that it depends on the maturity of your organization. Ironically, the more mature you are, probably the more NIS SOPs you need, because it gets really confusing, because you'll literally have a 20-page SOP. All it does is reference other SOPs, and they're an absolute The younger companies, God bless them, their SOPs are actually how they should have been to begin with. They literally tell you what you need to do and when. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
I would also say you should always have some SOPs that are specific to NIS, because there will be elements that you cannot take your clinical trial SOPs and shoehorn your non-interventional studies into them. There are others that you can, archiving and TMF, as long as you've got a relevant document index, you're good. Monitoring is an interesting one, because we talked about risk-based monitoring. And the fact that it's not a legal requirement, and you'll see with most companies, their monitoring SOPs will be very GCP, because it's a legal requirement. Why is it a legal requirement? GCP pretty much forms the foundation for most of the clinical trial regulations, and then the clinical trial regulations that GCP formed, they then tell you have to comply with GCP, as in the bits that weren't in the regulation. So you're tied in this loop. You don't have that for non-interventional studies. Investigator brochure, you don't need it. Drug reconciliation, it's not there. Study startup, I would always, because what you generally see is reg affairs, so regulatory approvals and ethics committee approvals are separate SOPs for clinical trials. You would pull these together for a non-interventional study and just keep them together, because there are very few countries where you would need a regulatory authority approval. It just gets confusing. Yeah. But SOPs, fun.
So from a filing,
SOPs, no.
So from a filing perspective in the TMF, would you say it's a lot less work, especially like in study startup? You'll probably be a little bit busier, but even in the interim, there's no monitoring. So what are you doing during that period?
There may be monitoring. And it's funny, because I've spent the last 20 years working on non-interventional studies, and I spent the last 2 years working on a lot of SOPs. It always bemuses me why we have to have an SOP on monitoring, which is study startup, interim monitoring visits. What does that mean? What does interim mean? And then you have a monitoring visit that's a closeout visit. Where did the term interim come from? Is this a GCP term? Because I see it so many places, interim, as in intermediate, between something. So between start and finish. Well, are you not just monitoring?
Right.
Yeah, this is just me. It's like, So,
No, you make a good point. You got the wheels spinning. I'm like, you're absolutely right. Just call it monitoring.
well, there are three companies' SOPs I've looked at in the last 12 months, and all of them have the term interim monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
Why? What are you monitoring, or are you not? Are you kind of monitoring? You know, there's some of the clinical trial language just doesn't make any sense. Think about SUSARs in Europe, a suspected, unexpected, serious adverse reaction. So when someone comes to your door and knocks on the door, and you expected them, you open the door and go, "Oh, hi." When someone knocks on your door and you didn't expect them, did you suspect that they were unexpected, or were they unexpected? It's such a stupid term, and we all use it. But it's like,
We do.
How can you suspect something is unexpected? It's either expected or it isn't. And it's like monitoring visits. You're either monitoring or you're not. What's an interim monitoring visit? It's between which other ones? Anyway, sorry, the question was, you see, I do rabbit hole. Yeah.
So I was talking about the TMF and the documents.
Yeah.
And how is there a lot of documentation when it comes to non-interventional studies? Is it less work? And then we got into interim. What are we doing during the interim?
Yeah.
The monitoring.
Yeah. So to your point, is there less work involved in TMF management for non-interventional studies? My answer to that is there should be. But if you're using the clinical trial TMF reference model, you haven't actually benefited from the fact that you have less documents, because then you have to manage the fact that you have to indicate that you don't have those documents. Otherwise, it's either an audit or an inspection finding, which is where we got to with the working group and the real-world study document index. It was a case of 60% of the documents that you have for your clinical trial TMF are not present for non-interventional studies. That's a lot of note to files.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to be going down that route, because that's a whole lot of pain. And I see it, we'll tie it back to the SOPs. What I'm seeing is companies trying to add NIS, non-interventional studies, to their clinical trial SOPs, and then telling either the project manager or the monitor to determine which elements of the attachments, whether it's a startup checklist, a monitoring checklist, are not applicable to non-interventional studies. Has that not actually deviated completely from the point of a standard operating procedure? If you spend all your time ticking boxes that say non-applicable, that's when you have to have the yes space that are specific to NIS. And this is where we get to with, it took a long time. So I think we started work on the NIS equivalent of the TMF reference model back in, I think I submitted the suggestion to Karen Roy, 2016. And I think we started 2000 and must have been 17.
Wow.
And we had a finalized document index in, I think it was summer of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
So for those that don't know, where can we look in the TMF reference model for NIS for any kind of guidance?
The reason why it's not well known is it's pretty much buried. It's now on the CDISC website, and you have to go to the resources section, and it's probably 4 or 5 documents down from there. I think at the time, there wasn't that much emphasis on real world evidence and real world evidence studies. Now that they're becoming more prominent, and I did speak to one of my clients who's a top 5 biotech, and I said, "Oh, did you not know about this?" And they weren't happy because they spent 2 years internally creating a TMF reference model equivalent for non-interventional studies. And this is why, this is a good time to say to people, it exists. We did the hard work. And the Excel spreadsheet itself, so it hasn't deviated. We started with the TMF reference model as, advocated by the steering group. We started with that, and then we truncated and we provided guidance. So we've got the one The index that's available on the CDIS website doesn't have the glossary, doesn't have the guidance. So we can provide the original document that has all of the kind of mindset behind what are you doing, what would a document look like.
So I always end my show with 2 questions that I like to ask my guests. And the first one is, what's the best career advice that you've ever received and who was it by?
My boss, Brian Higley, at what became GE Healthcare, and he just said, be yourself. Simple as
So
that.
simple. Be yourself. There's nobody else you'd rather be than just be yourself.
Well, it was, he followed that with follow your dreams, be yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Don't allow someone to tell you what you should or should not be. Be yourself is what it comes down to.
And lastly, what is your favorite TMF document and why?
Wow. Wow.
I stumped you.
You did. I don't know. Inspection report.
How come?
Only if it's good. For me, it's the culmination of everything that you have been trying to achieve in the TMF. And when you get a good report, say I was part of an MHRA inspection, when you get to the end and you've just got minors, you know that you and the team have done an epic job, and it was worth the blood, sweat, pain, tears, all of the above. Yeah. Not that you would file the full report in the TMF, I'm just saying, but
Right.
Yeah.
But you got the document, and that's what excites you.
Yeah.
Well, Stuart, thank you so much for joining us on the TMF Daily Podcast.
Well, thank you, Nicole. It's been a pleasure.